Imagine this. You walk into an Apple store to upgrade your phone and the price tag reads $1,199. You laugh it off thinking it's a mistake, but it's not. Later, you try booking a flight to visit your family across the country, but your airline quietly canceled the route. Again, no mistake, just fallout. Behind the scenes, something big is brewing. And if it feels familiar, that's because we've been here before, only this time, the game is more dangerous, the stakes are higher, and the playbook has changed. This is not just another trade war. It's Trade War 2.0. Now, for those of you who lived through the chaos of the first one, empty shelves, price hikes, supply chain nightmares, you know that when the US and China clash, it doesn't stay in Washington or Beijing. It hits Main Street, it hits your wallet, it hits jobs. But here's what's different this time. It's not just about tariffs, it's about technology, dominance, and resilience. It's a battle for who controls the future. From AI chips and electric vehicles to rare earth minerals and digital currency. And it all started again with Donald Trump. After stepping back from the spotlight, Trump is now reigniting tensions with China, blocking chip sales, reinstating tariffs, and pushing for economic decoupling. But China, they're not backing down. In fact, they've been preparing for this moment for years, quietly, strategically, patiently. What's unfolding now isn't just a fight over trade, it's a clash of ideologies, ambitions, and two very different economic models. So over the next 20 minutes, I'm going to take you deep into the heart of this modern Cold War. What triggered it, what it means for you, and what both sides are willing to risk to win. Because whether you're a business owner, a tech professional, a retiree managing your 401k, or someone just trying to afford your next grocery bill, this isn't some distant geopolitical drama. It's your economy, your future. Let's unpack what's really going on and why this time we can't afford to look away. You might be wondering, what exactly did Trump do this time that reignited the storm? Well, here's your mini shock. Even the watered-down chip that was specially designed for China, NVIDIA's H20, is now banned. Yes, you heard that right. Not just the top-tier H800, which was already restricted under Biden's administration, but now even the H20, a weaker, export-friendly version, is off the table. The move came swiftly and sent shockwaves through both Silicon Valley and Beijing. Let's break this down. NVIDIA, arguably the crown jewel of American AI innovation, had spent months creating the H20 chip, a compromise, if you will, just to stay in the Chinese market without violating export controls. Now, with this new ban under Trump's renewed offensive, even that backdoor is slammed shut. Analysts estimate this could cost NVIDIA over $20 billion in lost revenue by 2025. That's not just a blow to China, it's a massive hit to American shareholders, pension funds, and tech portfolios. If you're invested in a tech-heavy index, you're feeling this too, whether you realize it or not. Personally, I find this both bold and risky. Bold, because it sends a clear message. The US is serious about maintaining AI dominance. Risky because we're not just sanctioning a foreign rival, we're choking the revenue streams of our own companies in the process. And let's be honest, Wall Street doesn't care much for patriotic grandstanding when profits are on the line. This is the tightrope we're walking. We're trying to slow China down in the AI race, sure, but at what cost? Cutting them off from high-performance chips doesn't stop their ambitions. It just pushes them to go faster in developing their own alternatives. And meanwhile, we're leaving billions in global sales on the table. The impact of this decision goes beyond numbers. It's symbolic. It tells the world that US-China relations are no longer about negotiation. They're about confrontation. And in the tech world, that shift is seismic. Now, you might say, well, we've got to protect our national security, and you'd be right. But here's the nuance. Not all economic competition is a security threat. And if we treat it like one, we risk turning business partners into adversaries. That's a tough balance to strike, and quite frankly, I don't think we've figured it out yet. So what happens when China doesn't blink? What happens when they fight back? Not with missiles, but with minerals, aircraft deals, and diplomatic strategy? Let's take a closer look at how Beijing is responding and why their counterattack may be smarter than we think. Here's something that might surprise you. China didn't retaliate with loud threats or angry speeches. Instead, they reached for the scalpel, not the hammer. Within days of the US ban on NVIDIA chips, China quietly instructed its airlines to cancel billions of dollars in orders for Boeing aircraft. Not just a symbolic jab, but a calculated move that hits where it hurts. To be clear, Boeing isn't just another company. It's one of America's largest exporters, supporting hundreds of thousands of jobs, directly and indirectly, across the country. And while a $1.2 billion short-term loss may sound manageable, here's the catch. China was projected to buy 20% of Boeing's large aircraft over the next 2 decades. Walking away from that future means a whole lot more than canceled contracts. It's about a shift in loyalty, a warning shot to US manufacturing, and an open door for Airbus and China's own rising star, COMAC. And that's just the first punch. The second hit came in the form of rare earth minerals, specifically gallium, germanium, and antimony. Not exactly household names, right? But they're critical. These are the minerals used in semiconductors, electric vehicles, satellites, and advanced weaponry. And guess who controls more than 80% of the global supply of some of them? Yep, China. When Beijing restricted exports, it wasn't just about creating shortages. It was about reminding the world, especially the US, that global supply chains don't begin and end in America. This is where I think we've underestimated China. They didn't just lash out, they played chess. Instead of direct confrontation, they used interdependence as leverage. That's smart power because it's less about reaction and more about redirection. And while Washington tends to view these moves through the lens of confrontation, I see something more nuanced. China isn't just defending itself, they're repositioning. They're signaling to Europe, Southeast Asia, and even rivals like India, we're open for business, and we won't be isolated. For example, Spain is now courting Chinese capital to become a new European gateway. Vietnam saw Chinese investment rise by 80% last year. These aren't just economic plays, they're diplomatic ones. To me, this is the most fascinating part of the story, because while we're tightening the screws, China is shaking hands. They're canceling one deal with America and replacing it with 5 elsewhere. And that's where the long-term damage to US supply chains begins. Not with dramatic headlines, but with quiet rebalancing. So where does that leave us? If we keep pressing economically without a global support system, we might find ourselves isolated in the very system we once led. Next, let's talk about what decoupling really means and whether the US economy is ready for it. Let me ask you something. What if we could just cut China out of the picture entirely? No more dependency, no more leverage, no more back and forth. Sounds clean, right? Well, here's the twist. It's not only unrealistic, it might also be deeply damaging. That brings us to a term you've probably heard tossed around lately: structural decoupling. Now, this isn't just about tariffs or trade disputes. This is about intentionally and systematically separating two of the most deeply intertwined economies in the world. We're talking about breaking ties in technology, finance, supply chains, talent flow, the works. And let me tell you, doing that is anything but easy. Take Apple, for example. While they've started shifting some iPhone production to places like India and Vietnam, over 90% of their flagship devices are still assembled in China. And it's not just about labor, it's about an entire ecosystem of suppliers, engineers, logistics, and infrastructure that simply doesn't exist at scale anywhere else. Intel still relies on China for packaging and testing a significant share of its chips. Tesla? Its Shanghai Gigafactory is its most productive plant globally, by a mile. So when we talk about decoupling, we're not just talking about abstract numbers. We're talking about real operational disruption, massive costs, and years, if not decades, of adjustment. From my perspective, the bigger danger isn't that we can't decouple. It's that we try to do it too fast, without a real plan. There's a difference between building resilience and burning bridges. And that's a distinction we're not always good at making in American politics. Think about rare earth materials. China dominates the global supply of these inputs, and they're essential for everything from smartphones to missile guidance systems. Until we've built alternative sources and built them well, decoupling from China could mean decoupling from progress. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't rethink our dependencies. Frankly, I believe we should. But I also believe that smart strategy means understanding timing, capacity, and trade-offs. If we want a resilient future, we need more than tough talk. We need investment in alternatives, alliances with partners, and clear-eyed timelines. Otherwise, we risk hurting ourselves more than we hurt our rivals. So what would a smarter path look like? Let's explore how China is actually preparing for this decoupling, possibly better than we are, and what that might mean for the U.S. in the long run. Here's a question that rarely gets asked in Washington. What if China isn't reacting, but executing a plan they have had for years? Because if you look closely, that's exactly what seems to be happening. While the U.S. makes big, reactive moves, tariffs, sanctions, sudden bans, China plays the long game. Let's start with aviation. When China pulled its orders from Boeing, they didn't just walk away from American planes. They leaned into COMAC, their state-owned aircraft manufacturer. Now, COMAC's planes aren't quite ready to replace Boeing or Airbus globally, but that's not the point. The point is momentum. They're building domestic capability, testing designs, building trust with regional airlines. And if history has taught us anything about Chinese industry, it's that once they decide to master something, they often do. Think solar panels, EV batteries, high-speed rail. So we should ask, in 10 years, is COMAC the next global player? Because if it is, then Boeing's loss today is more than symbolic. It's strategic. Now let's shift to money. This part doesn't make many headlines, but it should. China is slowly pushing the Yuan as an alternative to the US dollar in international trade. They're building systems, like COMAC, to bypass SWIFT. They're cutting trade deals with countries like Russia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, even Brazil, in local currencies. And it's working. In fact, the Yuan's share in global trade has doubled since 2022. Still small, yes, but direction matters more than speed, especially when de-dollarization isn't about beating the dollar. It's about insulating themselves from it. I think this is one of the smartest, least flashy moves China has made. While the US uses sanctions as a weapon, China's asking, what happens when we no longer need to worry about US sanctions at all? And finally, diplomacy. They're not just wooing Europe with capital investments, they're repairing ties with regional rivals. In 2023, China increased its investment in Vietnam by 80%. In Spain, Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez openly welcomed Chinese capital as a gateway to Europe. Even India and China have resumed talks after years of border tension. That doesn't mean they're allies, but it means China is keeping doors open that the US might be closing. From where I stand, this all tells a story that's easy to miss. It's not just a counterattack. It's a quiet realignment. It's China saying, if the US shuts a door, we'll build 5 more. And while it's tempting to dismiss these moves as slow or superficial, I wouldn't, because empires don't crumble overnight, and neither do global strategies. China is building its future. One deal, one factory, one alternative system at a time. Which brings us to a harder truth. While China looks outward, America still looks inward. Let's talk about why that might be our biggest blind spot yet. What if I told you the trade war isn't just a Washington headline or a Beijing backroom negotiation, but something that's already hit your grocery bill, your job security, and your weekend travel plans? Let's bring this home, because this isn't just about tariffs or tech bans. It's about how global tension shows up in the life of the everyday American. Think about your last electronics purchase. That laptop you bought in 2020 for $799. Now it's over $1,000, and often for less power or fewer features. Why now? because chip shortages and supply chain shifts are no longer temporary. They're becoming a new normal, and they're not happening in a vacuum. Take travel, for example. When China pulled back on Boeing orders, it didn't just hurt a corporation. It meant fewer contracts, fewer parts being made in Wichita, Kansas, and fewer maintenance jobs in Seattle. Even the ripple effects can be massive. And let's talk about EVs, electric vehicles. You'd think demand is booming, and it is. But China controls over 70% of the world's battery materials, like lithium and cobalt. As decoupling escalates, those materials get harder to source, and prices go up. That shiny $35,000 EV? It could soon be $45,000 or not available at all. And who feels this squeeze the most? Middle-income families trying to make smart, sustainable choices, only to be priced out again. Now you might be thinking, well, we need to stand strong. And yes, national security matters. Tech dominance matters. But here's the part we don't hear enough. When two giants fight, it's often the people in between who get trampled. Inflation isn't just a number. It's the difference between making rent or putting off a doctor's visit. Layoffs aren't just stats. They're a father explaining to his kids why the family can't afford vacation this year. As someone who's seen how economic shocks ripple through communities, I truly believe we need more honesty in these conversations. Not just about strategy, but about sacrifice. And more importantly, who bears that sacrifice? Because it's rarely the ones signing trade deals or holding press conferences. It's folks like you and me, people trying to build stable lives in an unstable world. And if we don't talk about this side of the equation, we're only getting half the truth. So what happens next? Let's step back and look at the bigger picture. How America's allies are responding and what all this means for the global economy. Stick with me. We're heading there next. You've probably heard a lot about the US and China duking it out over chips, tariffs, and tech. But here's a question we don't ask enough. What about everyone else? Because while the spotlight stays fixed on Washington and Beijing, there's a whole cast of global players reacting, adjusting, and sometimes scrambling to keep up. Let's start with Japan and South Korea. Both are critical to the tech supply chain, leaders in semiconductors, displays, and high-end components. When the US pressures its allies to limit exports to China, these countries find themselves caught in a diplomatic and economic tug-of-war. Japan, for instance, agreed to curb exports of advanced chip-making equipment, but not without hesitation. Their companies, like Tokyo Electron, rely heavily on global demand. In South Korea, Samsung and SK Hynix have deep roots in China, with multi-billion-dollar fabs operating there. So when export bans hit, they risk losing both Chinese customers and market access. That's not a position any business likes to be in. Now shift to Europe. The European Union has tried to walk a delicate line, partnering with the US on values and security while maintaining trade ties with China. Germany in particular depends on Chinese demand for its cars and machinery. So when tensions rise, it's not just a distant echo, it's a direct threat to German jobs and GDP. And these are just the traditional allies. Think about emerging economies, Vietnam, Brazil, much of Africa. They're watching this great power standoff and asking themselves, whose side do we take? Or more realistically, how do we avoid picking sides at all? Because global polarization doesn't just create rival tech ecosystems. It divides infrastructure, banking systems, even digital standards. And for everyday Americans, this matters more than it might seem. Why? Because the more fragmented the global system becomes, the harder and more expensive it is to do business, travel, invest, and innovate across borders. We risk entering a world of duplication and inefficiency, two supply chains, two internets, two sets of rules. And let's be honest, that's not just costly for governments. It hits your wallet, your portfolio, and your sense of stability. Personally, I think we're at a crossroads. And I don't mean that dramatically. I mean it quite literally. We have to decide whether this path of decoupling and confrontation is sustainable, or whether there's room to rethink, re-strategize, and build smarter partnerships that preserve security without breaking the global system? That's the conversation we need more of. And as we close this deep dive, let's not lose sight of what's really at stake. Not just policy points or political wins, but the shape of the future economy. So let's bring it all home. In our final segment, we'll talk about what this all means for you and the choices we face before it's too late. So let's take a breath and look back at what we've uncovered. This isn't just a story about Trump's tariffs or China's tech ambitions. It's a window into a bigger shift, a new world where trade isn't just about goods, but power, where technology isn't just innovation, but influence, and where your wallet, yes, yours, is quietly caught in the crossfire. We've seen how tariffs on chips or planes don't just hit companies. They ripple through to consumers, workers, and retirees. We've explored how decoupling sounds like strategy until it means supply shortages, job losses, or rising prices on everything from iPhones to EVs. And we've looked beyond the headlines to see how allies like Japan and the EU are navigating their own balancing act. Because this isn't a two-player game. It's a global realignment with consequences far beyond politics. Now, what do we do with all this? I think the first step is awareness, genuine, informed curiosity. Don't let the news cycle skim over what matters. Dig deeper, ask tougher questions about who benefits, who pays the price, and what comes next. And don't underestimate your voice, whether you're voting, investing, or simply having dinner table conversations. Being informed matters. That's how smarter policies start, not just in Washington, but right here with people who care enough to pay attention. So here's what I'd love from you. Drop a comment below. Do you think the US should keep confronting China head on? Or is it time for a smarter, more strategic approach? And if you found this breakdown helpful, if you value conversations that go a little deeper than the surface, subscribe for more stories like this about the world, your money, and where we're all headed next. Because the future isn't just something we watch unfold, it's something we shape together.